Hi everyone, we're going to start off our literacy today with a grammar starter where we're going to be looking at the punctuation in sentences and seeing if we can fix it. So let's look at the first sentence together. The first one says, Mr. Twit couldn't believe his eyes. Now I notice there's an apostrophe there to show that could and not have been contracted together to become a contraction couldn't. But what is missing in this sentence? Well, we know that Mr. Twit is his name, so it needs to have a capital letter. So we'll change that. Mr. and Twit. And then couldn't believe his eyes. Now we need to finish that sentence. So we're going to finish that sentence because it's a statement. He couldn't believe his eyes. We need to finish it with a full stop. Let's look at the next one. He had hair growing out of his nose, ears and chin. Have a think. Is there anything wrong in that sentence that we need to get rid of? Pause it just so you can check. Let's see if you got them right. Now, I noticed that nose has a capital N, but nose isn't a proper noun. It's not the name of a specific thing. It's just a body part. So we need to take that capital letter away. I noticed as well at the end of the sentence we've got a question mark, but it's not actually asking anything. It's not a question. So I need to change that question mark to a full stop. He had hair growing out of his nose, ears and chin. Well, I've noticed there's a list sentence there. Nose, ears and chin are my three objects. And remember, when we are writing a list, we use commas. Nose, comma, ears and chin. So we need a comma after the word nose. And now that sentence has been fixed. Let's look at the last one. Again, why don't you pause it to see if you can work out what's missing? It says, "What are you laughing at?" asked Mr. Twit. What are you laughing at? It's a question, isn't it? But asked Mr. Twit isn't. So I need to put a question mark after the word at. But I've just thought that doesn't make sense because asked Mr. Twit is not the full sentence, is it? But that's something that the character is saying. Now I don't think I've really taught you much about this before, but when you are saying what a character is saying, you use something called speech marks. So you use a speech mark at the beginning of what the character is saying and the end of what the character is saying. So Mr. Twit is the one saying, "What are you laughing at?" So I do a speech mark at the start of what and after the question mark because he's asking that question. "What are you laughing at?" asked Mr. Twit. That was quite a tricky one. If you're a little bit confused about it, just remember that everything that goes inside the speech marks is what the character is saying, and everything that goes outside of the speech marks is just extra information, so who's saying it. Maybe you can have a go at writing your own speech sentence and see if you get that correct. Let's move on to the main part of today's lesson. Today we're going to be reading a little bit more of the Twits. So we're going to read and understand a fiction text. To be successful today, we're going to see if we can use our phonics to read words. We're going to see if we can use other reading strategies to read different words. We're going to see if we can use evidence from a text to support our answer, and we're going to see if we can give an opinion based on what is in the text. So, we're going to look at a chapter which is called The House, the Tree and the Monkey Cage. So I'm going to read this to you now. But that's enough of that. We can't go on forever watching these two disgusting people doing disgusting things to each other. We must get ahead with the story. Here is a picture of Mr. and Mrs. Twit's house and garden. Some house. It looks like a prison. And not a window anywhere. Oh dear, look at that house. "Who wants windows?" Mr. Twit said when they were building it. "Who wants every Tom, Dick and Harry peeping in to see what you're doing?" It didn't occur to Mr. Twit that windows were meant mainly for looking out of, not looking into. "And what do you think of their ghastly garden?" Mrs. Twit was the gardener. She was very good at growing thistles and stinging nettles. "I always grow plenty of spiky thistles and plenty of stinging nettles," she used to say. "They keep the nasty, nosy little children out." Near the house, you can see Mr. Twit's workshed. To one side, there is a big dead tree. It never has any leaves on it because it's dead. Not far from the tree, you can see the monkey cage. There are 4 monkeys in it. They belong to Mr. Twit. You'll hear about them later. Okay, so let's have a look at part of that text, and I'm going to ask you some questions now. I've put part of the text up there, and then I'm going to show you the question. If you need a bit of time to think, pause it after I've read the question. The first question is, What does Mr. and Mrs. Twits' house look like? What makes it look like this? So rather than just guessing, we need to look in the text and see what does it say that the house looks like. Here's a picture of Mr. and Mrs. Twits' house and garden. Some house, it looks like a prison. It looks like a prison. That's the answer to that question. And what makes it look like this? There's no windows anywhere, so that's why it looks like a prison. Let's look at the second question. Why has an exclamation mark been used after some house? Well, that exclamation mark has been used after some house because it's quite exciting and interesting, and it's showing, that's an exclamation, some house, huh? You wouldn't just say some house, you read it, some house, so it tells you how to read that with that exclamation mark there. Let's look at the second part of that text now. So here's the second part up here, and let's look at the first question together. What adjective is used to describe the garden? Remember that adjectives describe things, so it's describing the garden. I'd be looking for the word garden, or I'd be looking for a word that describes a garden. I found the word garden. If you look in the top line, you'll be able to find it as well. What word describes it? And that word is ghastly. Now, for this question, you don't actually need to know what the word ghastly means, because you're just looking for a word that describes it. Can you think, and what do you think of that ghastly garden? Well, the word ghastly means disgusting, horrible, ugh. So if you wanted to use a really exciting word later in the week when we do some writing, maybe ghastly would be a good word for you to use. Why does Mrs. Twit grow thistles and nettles in her garden? Again, pause it if you need some time to think. It says, I always grow plenty of spiky thistles and plenty of stinging nettles, she used to say. They keep out nasty, nosy little children, so they keep you out. And finally, last question. Tick 1. Mr. and Mrs. Twit's garden looks unattractive, delightful, glorious, sensational. So we need to know what each of those words means. If you get a question like this, where you have to tick one of the boxes and you don't know what one of the word means, but you know what the other three mean, then you'll be able to work out whether that one would be correct or not. So for example, the other day I was speaking to a child who said they didn't know what this word unattractive meant. Do you know what delightful means? Delightful means it's full of delight, it's wonderful. Glorious is another word that we use sometimes in our church songs talking about God. Glorious means really, really good. Sensational. If something's sensational, again, it's really, really good. Do you think that their garden looks delightful, glorious, or sensational? Absolutely not. Which means that the right answer must be unattractive. If something is attractive, that means that it looks really nice. But if it's unattractive, that's the opposite. That prefix un changes the meaning of the word from attractive, meaning looking really good, to unattractive, meaning not looking good at all. So today, I'd like you to go back to DB Primary now, and I'd like you to download the text and questions. Then I'd like you to see if you can answer those using evidence from the text. When you finish that, come back to this video and have a look at the open, and I might share the next chapter with you as well. Okay, so today our objective was to read and understand a fiction text. How was your presentation? How was your effort? And have a think about your next step. What do you need to do next time to make your writing even better? Pause the video and see if you can write your next step. And now we'll finish our lesson with the next chapter. The next chapter is all about something called hug-tight glue. Now we know what glue is used for. Hug-tight sticky glue. I wonder why Mr. and Mrs. Twit might be using that. Once a week, on Wednesdays, the Twits had bird pie for supper. Mr. Twit caught the birds and Mrs. Twit cooked them. Mr. Twit was good at catching birds. On the day before bird pie day, he would put up the ladder against the big dead tree and climb into the branches with a bucket of glue and a paintbrush. The glue he used was something called Hug-tight, and it was stickier than any other glue in the world. He would paint it along the tops of all the branches and then go away. As the sun went down, birds would fly in from all around to roost for the night in the big dead tree. They didn't know, poor things, that all the branches were smeared with the horrible hogtite. The moment they landed on the branch, their feet stuck, and that was that. The next morning, which was bird pie day, Mr. Twit would climb up the ladder again and grab all of the wretched birds that were stuck to the tree. It didn't matter what kind they were, song thrushes, blackbirds, sparrows, crows, little jenny wrens, robins, anything. They all went into the pot for Wednesday's bird pie supper. Not very nice people, are they, Mr. and Mrs. Twit? We'll continue learning a little bit more about them later on in the week. Well done for today for your reading. It was really, really good. And hopefully I'll be able to see some of that work on DP Primary.